Now, I understand that most of you have no intention of ever becoming a data analyst. I'm not a data analyst myself, never have been, but I've certainly had to do data analysis type of work in my career, and I would be shocked if you go on to be an accountant and never have to do any data analyst work yourself. So this video is going to be an introduction to the concept of Power Pivot. And before you dive into the examples that are posted online on this topic, I want to ensure that we review some key terms and concepts related to Power Pivot and working with data. Because even if you don't ever use Power Pivot, you'll probably use some of these concepts. If you use a different piece of software, the concepts are still the same. So you'll recall in an earlier video, I talked about how Power Pivot is not to be confused with a pivot table. And that's because a pivot table, if you recall, can only use data from one table. So pivot tables are very useful, but they are limited in terms of where they can draw their data from. Power Pivot can use data from many tables and in fact from many different sources. And what this ends up doing for the analyst or the accountant is it saves time and can provide a lot of really good insight because you can see the data in ways that you could not see it if you were looking at everything separately. Let's look at some of the key definitions with respect to data modeling. We'll talk about data model, fact, and dimension. Now, a data model. This is the way data from different sources relates to each other or relates to one another. Think about having different tables in a database or having data from a database and more data from another spreadsheet and then having data from a website. How does all of that link together? That is what we call the data model. And Excel actually allows you to view the data model visually, or some people would say in an abstract way, but it just means you can put your eyes on the data model. Data models are used to create pivot tables from multiple data sources, just what we talked about earlier. Here's an example of what a data model could look like. And you can see there's a bunch of tables there, or maybe you can't, but here's something. So sports in this data model is the name of a table. And in the sports table, we have two fields, sport and sport ID. And we can see that this table, the sports table, is connected to another table called disciplines. And the disciplines table has three other fields in it, discipline ID, discipline, and sport ID. So I would take it that it's the sport ID field in this table that connects to the sport ID field in this table. Here's another table, medals, and we can see a bunch of different fields in this table. One of the fields in the medals table is discipline ID, and we can see a connection of some sort going to the disciplines table. And I would gather that it's the discipline ID field that connects to the discipline ID field in the disciplines table. These other tables that we're looking at right now are not connected to the data model. It looks like they've been brought in, but they're not connected to one another. Maybe that changes going forward. Let's keep going. The next thing I want you to think about is something called a fact. Now, a fact in Excel and in data modeling parlance, right? The words that we're using are the kinds of words that a data warehouse would use or people that look at data a lot would use. And when they say a fact, they're talking about values or text that can be aggregated. Again, aggregated, what does it mean? It means you can do something with it. So maybe the sum of the amount as an example, okay? In a pivot table, because again, what are we doing? We're bringing data from a bunch of different sources and we're going to throw it into a pivot table to analyze. In a pivot table, you'll see here, I've kind of got the different field areas that you can see, right? In a pivot table, we'll always have a filter area, a columns area, a rows area, and a values area. And facts are always found, always found in the bottom right-hand corner of a pivot. So right over there, the values in a pivot table are the facts. This differs from what we refer to as a dimension of the data. And a dimension is considered a companion to the facts, or they describe or they're descriptors of the facts. Think of things like the account group or the customer type or the year, the month, the day, just to give you an example. And dimensions to our data reside in the other field areas in the pivot table setup box. So filters, columns, and rows, you can consider those to be dimensions of our data. Now, a convention that exists when doing any sort of data modeling is that facts and dimensions should be in separate tables where possible. In fact, a serious data analyst or a very serious accountant would tell you they always need to be separate. This modeling convention typically refers to fact tables and dimension tables. So when we talk about facts and dimensions, we mean we have to put them into their own table. And a fact table has at least one column or types of columns that have data in it that can be aggregated, right? So usually those values in that column would be numeric, right? But it could be text, I suppose. And then you will have another column in a fact table that helps you link to a dimension table. Now, in a dimension table, we have something called the primary key column. The primary key column is a unique entry for each row in the table and is used to link to other tables, right? It's a unique identifier. And then we have dimension fields, and this can have many repeating values, and they're often text-based. Now, we're going to look at a number of different examples, and there's going to be a bunch of examples posted on the Learning Hub. And I'd like you to go through the examples under the Power Pivot section on the Learning Hub. And in those examples, we're going to start off slow. We're going to start importing data in from a bunch of sources into an Excel file. Then we'll start doing things with that data so you can start to see how this is all useful. So please, at this point, download those files and move on to the next video.